I'm the principal consultant at Declarative Systems, a boutique IT consultancy based right here in Sydney. I consult for some of the world's largest companies, and I've been doing Puppet, amongst other things, for almost 10 years. I've met and worked with a lot of customers, and one thing I see a lot of is really complicated Puppet code whose function doesn't justify its existence. Sometimes it's a Forge module. Very often, it's in-house code that was written with the best of intentions by one, maybe two people who are the company experts. Most people who use Puppet for day-to-day administration are not going to be experts. They struggle with programming, debugging, and Ruby is basically voodoo to them. That's all right. It just means we need to do a better job as Puppet coders. Understandable code, documentation, and testing. There's another presentation I'd like to share with you that's about Python, but also applies to a lot of other languages, especially ones like Puppet. If you have some time after the conference, I highly encourage you to watch this video. If you do, you'll notice that I borrowed the I hate code bit from this talk. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Why do I hate code? Glad you asked. Here's why. First off, I have two levels of hatred when it comes to code. The first and worst type of code is kept inside a corporate private Git repository because reasons. This is generally terrible for all involved. If you class yourself as a programmer and work entirely in corporate Git repositories that cannot be shared, then you are invisible. Your work does not exist as far as the rest of the world is concerned. And to be honest, you're doing the equivalent of pouring your effort, hopes, and ambitions down the toilet by working this way. If you're a business and you insist on doing this, take a good hard look at the impact this has on the business itself. It makes your star programmers, the DevOps SRE crowd, miserable and harder to retain. Borrowing another line, things you own you. Every line of code you write comes with an ownership cost. Someone has to maintain it, and it will usually fail at inopportune times, such as OS or Puppet upgrades. I've seen and spoken to plenty of customers who download Forge modules, find they don't work properly in their own environment, make a fix, and then never contribute it back to the main project because they are not allowed to. When they come to upgrade, surprise, surprise, the module doesn't work anymore. Upstream has diverged, and now professional services engagement is required to put things right because the guy who did the original fix got fed up and quit. Speak to the Puppet sales team if you find yourself in this situation. That pretty much just leaves us with general code out there on GitHub or whatever. I hate this code because there is too much of it, and it's too hard for my feeble brain to understand. So that's what this talk is about. How can we take code that already exists, simplify it a ton, and still have it do the same thing? If we're writing a new module, how can we avoid booking a professional services engagement in 2 years' time to fix it? As programmers, we're taught at university how to make unnecessarily complicated computer systems. If you've been on an OOP course, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. There's another great comment in that last video. I can write 3 lines of code now so that I don't have to change 3 lines of code in the future. There's a great IT phrase my friend Geoff McCune introduced me to that summarizes this perfectly. He calls it building the Death Star. Building the Death Star involves writing unnecessarily complicated Puppet code today because we might need it tomorrow. From a business point of view, this makes no sense. Tomorrow may never come, in which case your effort was wasted. If it does come, we can refactor then, when there is a business need to do so. The phrase "you ain't gonna need it" should be at the back of your mind when you're writing modules. So how does this look in the real world? Let's look at the plans for a real Death Star that were obtained by the Rebel Alliance at great personal cost. You'll notice this module is my own. I'm as guilty of building Death Stars as everyone else. No one's perfect. Let's talk through the bad things this module does and why it sucks. Number 1 on the list, missing incomplete documentation. Number 2, huge list of parameters. I have no idea what any of them do because I forgot to write it down. Number 3, params pattern, enough said. Number 4, the one thing this module isn't fully guilty of, but I'll mention it anyway. Module almost, but not quite, split into install, configure, service, and init classes with the anchor pattern used to make them run in the right order. When we look inside each of these classes, we usually see, you guessed it, a single resource. As the guy in the video says, a class with 2 methods, one of which is called init, is not a class. If you see this in your Puppet code, congratulations, you've just discovered the exact same thing. I didn't deliberately set out to write bad code. I had my reasons, and it met the needs of a customer at the time. So why did I write this and not just use some module off the forge? From memory, I think that's exactly what I did. But there was a problem. I can't remember exactly what the issue was, but it was something about not being able to write a particular value in a config file because the file was written by a template. This particular customer had a requirement to preserve existing settings, white space, comments, and other random settings that were already in place. Why would they want to do such a thing? Because they're a huge company with a history of manually fixing up their fleet. There are lots of undocumented yet vital workarounds in place all over the place. And bulk replacement of files, quite understandably, terrified the customer. Since loss of configuration for vital services like SSH would have a real and immediate effect on the company bottom line. The customer is always right. Something else really important happens when a template gets used too, but nobody pays much attention. Notice when you receive OS updates that config files are often changed. That's because OS vendors are shipping security fixes by updating files. Do you manually pick through each update for every OS your module supports and make sure your Forge module includes the relevant updates? I sure as hell don't, and I'm pretty sure a few others bother. So let's look at what this module does right. It uses a tool called Augeus to edit instead of rewrite the config file. This means that customer workarounds and vendor updates will not be lost. If local customizations cause problems, the customer can revert the box to a clean state or add an exception to Hira. There's one other really great thing this module did from day 1 too, and that's to include full acceptance testing using a tool I wrote called PDQ-test. And yeah, that's about all the good stuff this module did to start with. I realized my module was a bit lacking when I went to teach a Puppet class and wanted to show the students something simple to look at. I threw it up on the projector. Did I really write that? How embarrassing. Time for an upgrade. This is the part of the story where acceptance tests become important. At first, my tests were pretty basic. Just make sure the values get written to the right file. But we can do better than that. Why don't we at least check the service is running? Acceptance tests are critical in order to be able to show up, in order to refactor mercilessly. They almost always show up bugs that would have been missed otherwise. When I refactor my own code, if my test passed first time, I've usually missed something. So let's review version 1.0 of the module. Pretty much all I did here was consolidate my split up classes into one big one. There are still lots of parameters and resources, but the code is a lot easier to understand. Instructions to customers make everyone's lives easier, so this release adds documentation. Using Puppet strings and PDQ-test, I was able to generate API-style documentation from code comments. If you're not already using Puppet strings, I can't recommend it highly enough. Anyone working with me is forced to use it from the get-go, because guess what? No one's going to go back and add it otherwise. That was enough to share my embarrassment until the next time I taught a course. Remember what I said about not writing a line of code now to avoid writing one tomorrow? Time to go and do something more interesting. Long time passes and I need to use my code again. Guess what? The parameter I need to set for the customer isn't in that huge list of parameters. One way to fix this would be to just add it, but where's the fun in that? I took a long, hard look at my module, and then I thought, why don't I just use a simple hash and iterate it? I could map the hash keys to the config file and support any setting without needing to explicitly support it. Now we get to the best part of the talk. I wasn't joking when I said you could delete a lot of your Puppet code and still get the same outcome. First off, the parameter list, 38 parameters to 13. Next, let's delete all of those individual SSHD config resources and use iteration, 80 lines to 5. Remember the params pattern that's been in Puppet since almost forever. Those params classes can be blown away if we use in-module data. Entire params class deleted. The module isn't perfect, but it's good enough for the moment, and it's a lot simpler than it was. If you want it fixed up even more, you can either hire me or send in a pull request, or you could just not worry about it and move on with your life. That's all well and good if you're a Puppet module maintainer, but what about the people who matter the most in all this? Puppet customers. I don't just sit at home writing Puppet modules for randos on the internet all day. I do actually have to go and visit customers all the time. This is the part of the job where I get to look at that code I talked about earlier that slowly rots on the internal Git server. It still has to exist in some form, but a big part of my job is making it easier for customers to manage it. A little while ago, I visited a customer who had a huge Puppet code base. I won't name them, but I'm sure they know who they are. This customer was unusual because they had some real good Puppet talent and a whole building full of real developers. What on earth did they need me for? I found this out the first morning of the engagement. Not only had a new Death Star been built, but it was also fully armed and operational. IT Ops owned the Death Star, which they used to enslave and control the native Ewok developers. The Ewoks were quite rightfully upset about this, but what can a 3-foot-high furry do against the Death Star? IT Ops never meant to build a Death Star. And they were only looking out for the Ewoks to stop them doing goofy stuff all the time. Deep down, IT Ops acts as a concerned parent, but in this case it was too overbearing and somehow a balance had to be found. Like my SSH module, this just kind of happened. The only way this new Death Star was going to be destroyed was if Darth Vader picked up the Emperor and threw him down the conveniently placed shaft. Fortunately, Darth didn't take much convincing. With his buy-in, we were able to start drastically simplifying the massive Death Star that had been built. I won't go into too many details here. Being a consultant is a bit like being a doctor, and if you want an accurate diagnosis, you got my number. But here's the quick start section from Death Star Operations 101. To deal with a new app release, first off, fork Puppet control, data, Hira, roles and profiles repositories. Step 2, write Puppet code to get settings from Hira and write them to the config file. Every setting gets its own parameter, just like version 1 of my SSH module. Okay. Each different application these guys had its own Puppet class, so there are about 100 of them. Okay. All of this has to be in place for an update to happen, and all of this has to be Git committed in order to actually test anything. Okay. The reality of this process is that IT Ops block developers from releasing Puppet code, from releasing apps, and slowed project velocity because changes to Puppet were required to even test a new app. A completely unreasonable request when you take a step back, and one that was impacting the business bottom line by slowing releases and burning developer time. How did our Ewok friends deal with this? The only way they could. They disabled the Puppet agent. This worked in the development environment, but what about production? Our Ewoks weren't content to still face a ton of work when they went to cut a prod release. That's where I came in. They called Puppet Professional Services. Casting an eye over their 10,000 plus line code repository, right away I noticed the code smell. It looked like most of the classes were basically doing the same thing. So part 1 of my prescription was to consolidate the things that looked the same into a single class with arguments. Long-term goal, 10,000 plus lines to 1,000 or so. Next up was the requirement to edit Puppet to make a settings change. Seems unreasonable to me. So we ended up making a proof of concept system to look up details from Hira, dump them into a file, and then have another process rewrite the app config files. For homework, I told these guys to get in touch with Craig Dunn, the roles and profiles guy, about Jerakia. From talking to Craig, Jerakia can be used as a drop-in replacement for the Hive REST server these guys had already built. I just described version 2.0 of this company's Puppet code. If the company do their homework, version 3.0 will use Jerakia and bypass Puppet completely for doing settings changes. Outcome, customer able to add new settings by editing Hive data, not Puppet code. Default settings obtained from project, and release velocity no longer restricted by Puppet. Drastically simplified release process, and size of Puppet codebase reduced tenfold. The customer wasn't setting off fireworks, but they were sure happy they could get some work done. Meanwhile, on another planet, far, far away, in a parallel universe, the Ewoks were running wild. In this parallel universe, the Ewoks had it pretty good. They could do all the goofy stuff they ever wanted, which included doing releases by installing random stuff on random systems, breaking said random systems on public holidays while doing releases, and of course, forcing IT ops to fix said systems on said public holidays while they were supposed to be at home relaxing. Needless to say, IT ops were pissed, real pissed. They called me in to build them a goddamn Death Star to blow up the Ewoks so they could enjoy time at home with the family or whatever it is young families do. This customer decided that the best way to build a Death Star was to buy Puppet Enterprise, throw in a bit of consulting, and enslave the Ewoks forever so that ops could live a life of barbecue and beers by the pool in the Australian sun. They brought me in as Chief Death Star Engineer, and about halfway through their journey, I managed to get both factions to meet me for a discussion. I'll spare you the details, but the outcome of the discussion was, every dog needs to eat. Every cat needs to eat. Dogs hate sharing their food with cats. Cats hate sharing their food with dogs. Dogs have their own food in a bowl marked dog, and cats have their own food in a bowl marked cat. Believe it or not, I'm not talking complete nonsense here. Go check out the SELinux coloring book. Yes, it's a real thing. How does this relate to Puppet? Developers were shipping releases by dropping shared library files into Puppet modules as file resources, which were then scattered like confetti across several systems. Of course, this only worked about half the time, and devs were angry that they had to even do this much work. Remember, they had to write a ton of Puppet code to make this work. That's good. Feel the rage. Embrace it. Why shouldn't things be simpler? When you go to install new software on your computer, do you randomly copy 50 or so .dll files all over the computer? Of course not. We just double-click the installer and that's it. Why should it be any harder for our Puppet users? Because we make it that way. Puppet doesn't have to be your Room 101, at least not unless you make it that way. How can we simply install software on any platform with Puppet? That's right, we can make a package. It's really simple. A graduate could do it. Heck, I used to do it when I invented DevOps in a company in Manchester, England back in 2004 by installing Apache and MySQL, doing a bit of PHP programming, and as a bonus, also making the tea. To make a package, number 1, read the instructions. Number 2, follow the instructions. Number 3, put the package somewhere. And number 4, install the package. So what happened after the discussion? Was a revolt by the Ewoks to the Death Star that was being planned. After our chat, the Ewoks realized getting IT ops to miss family time for their goofy mistakes was completely unreasonable. Imperial forces also recognized that Ewoks should be able to live free and happy lives without fear of being blown up. In the real world, first off, devs realized they should be making packages, not random .so files. And second, everyone realized they should be using something like either Artifactory or Nexus. What are these things? Basically, they both do the same thing. They let teams publish binaries with a name and a version number and then reference it in a working system. Basically, that's it. But this is a huge thing. There's one more thing I'd like to share with you. And that's an unanswered by me email I wrote to Luke Knies back in 2014. The highlights were, Puppet is simple and easy to use, except when it isn't. Puppet makes the hard things easy and the easy things impossible. In a former job, I vividly recall getting up early to come to work to try to fix problems. I'd get into work at 8 a.m. and make a promise to myself not to leave until I was done. I'd end up going home at 9 or 10 at night and still wouldn't have fixed the problem that was blocking me. The technical questions my email asked were, number 1, how do I iterate an array? Number 2, how do I change a variable? Number 3, how do I build an append-only array? Luke replied back to me, but I never replied back to him. I wish I had. I replied to someone else instead, several times, and that person was Henrik Lindberg. At least some of Puppet Professional Services refer to this guy as Mr. Complicated. Personally, I love talking to this guy. You are guaranteed to learn something, whether you wanted to or not. So what did Mr. Complicated have to say about the first Death Star and the contents of my email? In fairness, he said nothing because I never asked. But in 2018, with Puppet 5 released and Puppet 6 soon to be in Puppet Enterprise, as in now, my questions become a no-brainer. We can iterate an array with .each. How do I change a variable? You don't. Welcome to the world of massive concurrency, declarative, and functional programming. How do I build an append-only array? In Puppet 5, we can append an array sort of like this. In this code, we use Puppet iteration functions to loop over selected data all at once, processing things along the way, and basically giving us exactly what we wanted. When I showed this to my customer, his eyes lit up. So you've moved us from infrastructure as code to infrastructure as data. Holy crap, he was right. We'd just invented a new Puppet paradigm, infrastructure as data, with the idea that the whole fleet is configured by high-array YAML files, with the Puppet code, the .pp files, identical in all environments eventually. That was going to be all I was going to show you, but Henrik dropped another gem on the community Slack channel as I was writing this. That's right, Puppet 6 lets you run functions on the node as well as on the master. The title of this talk was Do More with Less, but so far all I've talked about is deleting Puppet code. How does this class as doing more? Simple. Leaner, less fragile Puppet code can be rolled out to more nodes and faster. Remember that team I was talking about that disabled the Puppet agent before? Now those guys are talking about rolling out Puppet to development environments and even workstations. In summary, do testing. Delete as much Puppet code as possible, using the cool new features from Puppet 4.5.6 to enable this. Try not to build Death Stars. Instead, build droids, reusable tools to do your bidding. Most important, stop blowing each other up. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. I'll be hanging around on Slack for the next 20 minutes or so if anyone has any questions. Thanks everyone for listening.